Welcome to another session of Rooster Talk. At the moment, I've got Mark Anderson here, the CEO of FISH, which stands for Foundation of Indigenous Sustainable Health. Thank you, Mark, for giving us time. As I always do, it's your show. Let's intro yourself and what you're about.
Pleasure, Noel, and great to be on your Rooster Talk. And before it starts, we always like to do an acknowledgement. It all depends on what part of the country of Australia that I sit on will be dependent on the acknowledgement. So I'm on what's called Whadjuk land. So I would say Nalakadich Whadjuk Mort, Kayan Kadak Nidjabudja, which is acknowledging the Whadjuk people as the original custodians on the land on which I meet today. For the contribution they've made and the contribution that they continue to make ongoing. You know, we've got 65,000 years of deep knowledge, wisdom and history that's been passed down from generation to generation. And we've got a lot to learn. And I think in Australia, you know, we should be celebrating that we've got one of the oldest living cultures, ongoing cultures in the world. And I think that's just a fantastic asset that we've got as a country.
Oh, great. Hey, Mark, just introduce what FISH is about, and I think it's I mean, from where I work and live, I guess it's really something that's intriguing, and what Australia is all about, I guess.
Yeah, so FISH is it stands, as you said before, for Foundation for Indigenous Sustainable Health. And the acronym is FISH. And I suppose if you look at the old saying that if you teach someone to fish, if you give someone a fish, you only feed them for a day, but if you teach someone to fish, you feed them for a lifetime. So a lot of the work that we're involved in, and I'm a Gadiya Wadjala, a white fella, and a lot of our board and our staff are Aboriginal people, and FISH was set up in that space. And so we come from a strengths-based process. So we believe that Aboriginal people have a lot of wisdom and knowledge to share and they're leaders in how to care for country and how to care for the environment, but also how to care as a community. But our mission as an organisation is a real deep understanding of the impact of terra nullius and the kind of policies that then follow that through in Australia has caused intergenerational trauma, poverty and engagement in the justice system for Aboriginal people. So our mission is to improve the social and emotional wellbeing of Aboriginal people and to help break those cycles of intergenerational poverty, trauma and engagement in the justice system and enable Aboriginal people to take back their position of healing and connecting people to caring for the environment and caring for each other. So it's very strength-based. Now, ultimately, our mission will disappear and we'll kind of go back to a more strengths-based approach. So that's a little bit about what FISH is about.
Yeah, in terms of where are you guys at? I mean, there's a lot of stigma and a lot of talk in the media as well as in industries. I'm from a geologist. I've worked in that industry, so I've seen a lot of, you know, maybe similar to what you guys are doing. A lot of companies that are run by the Aboriginal community. It does well, makes money. Where do you think Australia sits in this issue, if you want to put it that way?
I think from our perspective, if we don't understand our past, it's very difficult to understand where we are today to then know how together we can move forward. And I think one of the things that Australia's struggled with is to really deeply understand our past and because of our past, how that impacts where we are today. If we don't understand that, it's very difficult for us to then use that as a foundation to kind of know how to move forward. And there's a lot of positive things that are happening in Australia. I think we're at a real turning point. We do have a long way to go. So if you think, you know, I've been working in this space for over 35 years and 38 years ago when I started, 80% of the prison population in juvenile detention centres were Aboriginal kids. Last year, 76% of our juvenile detention population is still Aboriginal kids. And so in 35 plus years, nothing has changed. And yet those Aboriginal kids are only 3% of the population. When you look at the Prime Minister's report for Closing the Gap, which was delivered in January of this year, of the targets of 7 targets that were set 11 years ago, only 2 of those targets are going to be met. And so even some of the targets around the longevity of how long Aboriginal people live to non-Indigenous people, that gap has not closed. It's actually growing because non-Indigenous people's length of life is increasing at a faster rate than Aboriginal people. So, you kind of then ask the question, why haven't things improved significantly? We've got more Aboriginal kids in care today than we had in the stolen generation. We still have large proportions of Aboriginal people who are not employed compared to non-Aboriginal people. We've got lower educational rates and completion of Year 12. We have the completion of going into university and successfully completing university is lower for Aboriginal people. And so then you ask the questions, well, why is that so? And if you don't understand the past, then again, you don't understand where we are today.
In terms of, breaking that cycle, how do you see industry contributing to do this? I mean, this is not a new story. This is not a new problem. The solutions that have been, what we'll discuss is probably not something new as well. But do you see any sort of outlier solutions that would help break the cycle?
Look, again, we at Fish, we run professional development training for corporations and for medium-sized businesses, not-for-profit organisations and government departments. And the training that we do in that space is really focused on how do you shift someone's head knowledge, heart knowledge, and spirit within them to understand kind of like where we are today. Corporates are wanting to kind of be very active in this space. And if you go back in the business sector with Australia, I don't know if you remember years ago, there was a commitment with Generation 1, the federal government. It was led by Twiggy Forrest, which was really looking at trying to shift the psyche of Australia, whereas in the past it was really focused on seeing, and my Aboriginal elder mate would say, poor blackfella type attitude, where business felt, that poor blackfella, we got to do something. And where there was a shift in our thinking in Australia to view Aboriginal people as a real asset from a business perspective, and why are we as businesses not actually being able to connect with appropriately and benefit from the relationship with Aboriginal people. And I think that shift in thinking in Australia has really changed how we begin to work with, listen to, and then come together and have positive change. And I think, there's some great examples in Australia. If you look at Coles, over a decade ago only employed 65 Aboriginal people across Australia. And they started on this journey of really wanting to bring change. Well, they've just celebrated employing 4,800 people, Aboriginal people across Australia. Most people don't know that Coles is the largest employer of Aboriginal people in Australia now. And just recently, with their COVID response, they employed another 400 plus Aboriginal people within their business structure. The most significant thing, people go, that's a great number, but I would say one of the most significant things with Coles is that over 275 people within their employment structure are actually sitting in management positions. So, and that's been a real benefit for Coles as a company. And it wasn't a poor blackfella kind of decision making for Coles. It was actually a strategic business decision that has proved to be of real business benefit for Coles. I think another great example is if you look at FMG. FMG now have got over $2 billion worth of contracts with Aboriginal businesses in the provision of services to the mining industry. And those businesses are providing high-end, real professional services to the community. And the benefit that they're bringing is not just from a corporate perspective, but from another way of doing business. And I always talk about a fellow called Barry Maguire, who's a Noongar leader in Western Australia. And he runs a company called Red Spear. And he runs his company with a very strong professional business ethos, but he also runs his company with the integration of Aboriginal culture embedded in his organisation. And he works with big companies like Chevron and Rios and things like that. But how he goes about his business is really much from a relationship base and a cultural focus. And I think the benefit of that cultural way of doing business has been highly successful for him. And I think he's sharing that knowledge and that learning with the non-Indigenous businesses that he's working with. And so there's some real benefits in that space. We still have a long way to go. And I don't think the answer is pushing Aboriginal people into setting up their own businesses, because, you know, for non-Indigenous people, you know, there's a lot of businesses who don't kind of get through the 18 months. But I think it's creating workplaces that understand the history of Australia, understand the challenges that Aboriginal people still face today, and then how do we together create culturally safe spaces where we can all learn from and benefit from each other. And I think as we do that together, I think that's where the benefit for business and the Aboriginal community come to the fore.
Yeah, from my experience, I mean, I know a lot of Aboriginal businesses in the, call it the outback, call it the mining industry, call it the agriculture business and things like that. But is it correct assumption or to say that there is not a lot visible in the areas like the non-mining, outback kind of businesses?
Yeah, look, I think, you know, our highest proportion of Aboriginal people are in our cities and in our major regional centres. And I think the lack of visibility for Aboriginal people in employment in those spaces certainly has been an issue for many, many years. And I think it's how do we create, and there's a lot of positiveness from non-Indigenous companies in wanting to engage in employment in these spaces, but often they are kind of going through a process of, we're not sure how do we go about this, we don't really understand kind of how to do this effectively, and so there can sometimes be a hesitation. I think from Fish's perspective, you know, when we talk about reconciliation action plans and things like that, you know, we're really looking forward to the day where we don't need to have a reconciliation action plan. I'm not saying that we shouldn't have them, but we've got to get to a point where we don't need to have a sense of reconciliation, because, well, why wouldn't we employ Aboriginal people in our business? Why wouldn't our businesses be culturally appropriate for Aboriginal people? Why wouldn't we see the benefit of working with Aboriginal people? I think the challenge that we face with reconciliation action plans is they kind of sit there and they've got targets that we're working towards, but reconciliation, you can reconcile with someone, but then that relationship can still break down. I think the focus that we have at Fish is really wanting to change how we go about our business, so that we change the DNA of our organisations to, instead of talking about reconciliation, we don't even need to talk about it anymore, because it's just what we do. It's, you know, Australia has one of the richest cultures that in the world that's recognised in a lot of places overseas, but we don't celebrate it and recognise it enough in Australia, I don't believe.
Yeah, I mean, you watch internationally, you watch the celebration of the haka and things like that, but in Australia we have, you know, similar things, but it's you just don't see it. You don't hear. It's not celebrated. It's not talked about. You know, you go to YouTube and you see hakas everywhere, and you don't see the same for the Aboriginal community, which is,
and again,
based.
Yeah, and people go, I don't understand that. But again, if you don't understand our history, you don't understand where we are today. So if you look at the history of Australia, the law of terra nullius was created back in when white men came to Australia. And the law of terra nullius is, it's a Latin word which means no man's land. So the law of taking over Australia was, there's no one here, therefore, or the land is not looked after, therefore we can take that land. And so terra nullius came into existence through that process. And yet, when you look back in history, you look back in the 1400s and you look at the Dutch maps of Australia, there's actually Aboriginal people painted on those maps of 1451. There's a famous map, and you can see Aboriginal people in that painting of Australia who are fishing, who are doing resources. In the 1400s, the 1700s and 1800s, there were records of the Dutch who are recording international trade between Aboriginal people and the Dutch East Indies. In all of the journals of Australia, of people coming to Australia in the earliest historic journals of when people were navigating Australia for the first time, in all those journals there's a record of seeing the fires and Aboriginal people living across the country. And yet, even though there was all of that historical information and things like that, terra nullius was still put as a law, as a rule. What then happened was, and then a lot of people say, well, why weren't Aboriginal people recognised in the Constitution of Australia? So when terra nullius was come into effect, that gave the right to take land, to take the resources and everything else like that, and to move Aboriginal people off. When that happened, what then happened is, when the Constitution was written in 1901, Aboriginal people weren't actually recognised in the Constitution. People say, well, why weren't they recognised in the Constitution? Well, if you recognised Aboriginal people in the Australian Constitution, guess what no longer exists? Terra nullius. Because by recognising Aboriginal people in our Constitution, you're therefore saying that Aboriginal people were actually here before white men came. So if Aboriginal people were here before white men came, you then have a situation where the law of terra nullius can no longer exist. So if that's the case, then what do you have to do? Then you have to write a treaty, which is what New Zealand has. And so a lot of people say, well, what's the difference between New Zealand and Australia? The difference between New Zealand and Australia is New Zealand has a treaty with the Maori people. Australia doesn't have a treaty with Aboriginal people. So from the writing of the Constitution in 1901, up until 1967 in Australia, Aboriginal people were not recognised as human beings or as people in Australia. And that didn't change until 1967 with the amendment to the Constitution. So because Aboriginal people are not recognised as people within Australia, you don't have to provide education, you don't have to provide housing, and a whole range of other things that occurred because of that. So up until 1967, none of that happened. But when the law of recognising Aboriginal people in Australia in 1967 came into effect, all of a sudden there's a whole bunch of legislation that then had to change from that point. The challenge that we face in Australia is, if we don't understand our past, we don't understand where we are today. And so by understanding terra nullius, by understanding the Constitution of 1901 and why that happened, that then impacted on all the flow through policies until 1967, when Aboriginal people were finally recognised in the Constitution. And then from there, things have begun to change. Now, terra nullius, from a legal perspective, under law, was not actually changed until the 1990s, when the Mabo decision came into account. So up until the Mabo, a lot of people think the Mabo decision was actually based on the Queensland mob getting rights to their land. Well, actually, no. For the first time in the High Court of Australia, terra nullius actually, under law, was said it no longer exists. And so that wasn't until the early 1990s. Up until then, terra nullius, under law, still existed. So from the 1990s until we are where we are today, terra nullius no longer exists. We don't have a treaty. So where are we from a legal situation? Well, you can argue under law that if a treaty doesn't exist and terra nullius no longer exists, then everyone else in Australia besides Aboriginal people is classed as an invading force under law. So there's some really interesting things when you start unpacking history and unpacking where we are today to understand that. I mean, most people don't even know in Australia that until the mid-70s, there were laws, legislation in some of the states and territories in Australia where a principal in a high school could deny Aboriginal kids from having education, from actually attending school. And that was until the mid-70s in Australia. So if you've been denied education and things like that, then Aboriginal people are playing catch-up, because they haven't had access to a lot of the education, a lot of the information and things like that. So there's all of those things that kind of impact on where we are today. And then for businesses to be engaged or to effectively kind of move people into their organisations, if they don't understand the impacts of generational trauma, then often they don't understand how people are struggling where they are today. I mean, and that also has to take into account stolen generation. I mean, most people don't understand that up until 1967, the government legally could take Aboriginal kids away from families. So if I was to, do you have kids, Noel?
Yeah.
How old are they?
21, 18, 15.
Yeah, so I've got a mate who is 10 years older than me. And as a kid, he was sitting in a park with his grandparents and his mum and dad were off at the shops. And he was running around with his two sisters in the park and having a great old time. And then what was called the Aboriginal Protector walked across the road and took him and his two sisters away from their family and put them in the car and drove them off to a mission. Now, his grandparents couldn't do anything because they would have been arrested. Parents came back to the park and the kids are gone. And for years, and then when they got to the mission, he was separated from his two sisters. And so all of a sudden he came from living in this safe family environment to being ripped out of that and taken away and then separated from his sister and then traumatized for the next 15 years in a mission situation. And by the time he got out of the mission, his family was so brokenhearted by having their children taken and having no power to get the children back, that then generated trauma, and then you mix alcohol into that, and so then you create this cycle. And then as an adult, when he gets out, he comes back into this broken situation where he left when it was a beautiful family. And so then that trauma then gets carried in generations and flow through to... So if we don't understand the impacts of those elements, then how do we understand the impact of those families and how they're still carrying some of that trauma today? So they're kind of the thing. Yeah, go on.
Just from an organisation point of view, like for fish, I guess, I mean, those kind of things, I mean, they're generation issues, which only time, well, people use this phrase, I'm not so sure if that's such an easy thing to say, only time will heal. But going forward as an organisation and what you guys are trying to do, are you trying to sort of make the businesses or, trying to match history with what the future should be? Is that the path forward for fish?
I think one of the paths forward is understanding. I think as we understand and we kind of understand where each other's coming from and things like that, I think within understanding, people can connect together and can walk together. I think if there's no understanding, it's very difficult to know how to walk together. And I think with understanding comes acceptance, acknowledgement. And, Aboriginal people, a lot of people said, with the Prime Minister apologising, a lot of people said, well, what do I have to be sorry for? I didn't do that. My family, what's to be sorry for? And, I was sitting with this old Aboriginal fellow years ago when Howard, who was the Prime Minister of Australia many years ago, was saying we don't need to apologise. And, he said, it's because that was in the past and it's not something I did. And he said, well, that's interesting. He said, because I remember as a child running through the pasture, having a pastoralist take pot shots at my dad and me, trying to kill us. And he said, I remember as a child having my aunties, uncles and cousins be killed because they were given poison flour as children. And they died because of that. He said, that's my story. He said, and that's our story as a country. And, you know, the apology has nothing to do with you saying sorry for something you've done. All it's saying is, as a country, we're really sorry that these things happened, and that we want to make sure that these things never happen again. We want to understand our past, but by sharing in those stories, we know where we are today. And then by knowing where we are today, then together we can walk shoulder to shoulder to bring real change. And in the business sector, you know, when we run the PD and things like that, we find that people in business go, I never knew that. I never understood that. Now I understand that. It kind of then starts changing this is going back to what we were talking about, the DNA of the organisation, to then say, wow, how do we make this country better? How do we work together more effectively? And then from there comes a real richness of engagement and relationship. You know, how do you have a relationship? How do I have a relationship with you? I've got to get to know you. I've got to get to know your story. I've got to get to know your heart, your wurrun, your spirit. When I do that, that gives us a foundation on which our relationship grows richer every day. In business, we forget about the importance of relationship. We rush ahead trying to do business, trying to do transaction, whereas the foundation to business is actually relationship. Aboriginal people know that, they get that. So when you meet an Aboriginal person, you spend the first part of the time actually sitting down and having a yarn. Who are you, Noel? Where were you born? Where do you come from? What's your story? What connections do we have? And then I share my story with you. And when we do that, that creates a foundation by which we work together. And when we do that, there's actually richness in our relationship. And from that, when you have challenges like COVID and things like that, because you've got a strength of relationship, you are more responsive to work together. When you're transactionally focused, when there's trauma, you move internally, because your relationship with the other business is about what can I get from you? Whereas when it's a relationship, it's about how do we work together to bring benefit to each other and community. It's a different way of doing business. And Aboriginal people have been doing business that way for a long time. And I think when I talk to non-Indigenous businesses who are working with people like Barry Maguire, one of the things that they talk about is they enjoy the richness of the relationship they have in business. Whereas it's a different way of saying, you know, of a transactional relationship. There's a richness in it compared to a transaction in it. And I think COVID, interestingly enough, is forcing people to reassess what are the important things of life. And one of the things that we hear about people being at home is they've re-established the relationships with each other in their families and how important that is. And then they've also talked about we're missing the relationships that we have with each other, both within the work environment and in the community. And maybe we're being forced to reassess all that.
We had that conversation before we started. I think we are in agreement that COVID has created a very unique situation where, you know, everyone's reassessing, and a bit of what you touched on about how you're starting to get to know things, and then you become more accommodating to each other. I think it has created that in some sense. But some of the things you touched on, I mean, we came here in 1981, so I've been here, you know, a good time now, and also shows my age. But that kind of story, I have to say that although I've been in, you know, I came to school here, I worked in the outback and all that, I would say that I have never really heard that explained that way. And I'm not sure why. I think maybe it's just the circumstance of where I've worked and I've traveled, but it's not out there. And you get a lot of negative stuff. And I've worked in the outback and I've met a lot of Aboriginal elders. And yes, you see all the bad things, but you also hear a lot of good stuff, which doesn't transcend back to the city, to my industry now. And what you've explained is actually not. I don't think I've heard that before in that manner. You know what I mean?
Oh, look. I mean, I can take you through a whole pile of history and what happened and why it happened and the impact that that had. And then when you change the legislation, so creating rules within an organization or any society or any community actually helps embed the culture. And so when you understand the rules and the policies and the flow on procedures that were embedded in our legislation in Australia, that actually created it almost kind of impacted on the racism within people. So when Aboriginal people weren't recognised as human beings in our constitution, then you had every right to take the land, you had every right to, in some areas of Australia, Aboriginal people were hunted for sport. It was a known thing in some of the areas that I've lived in. The history of those kind of areas, it's still talked about as being known. Because if you're not listed as a human being, then then those impacts. And they're the things that as Australia, when we hear it, we kind of smart and go, oh, that doesn't sound right. I don't want to hear that. If you actually read, and some of the training that we do, we actually read the legislation. And a lot of people have seen some of the old photographs with Aboriginal people with chains around their neck. We actually read from the legislation in the 1935 Act, this is 1935, where it actually says chaining an Aboriginal person around the neck was viewed as humanitarian. And that's actually written in the legislation. And so when the legislation is embedded like that, and we go, well, why do these attitudes kind of exist? Well, sometimes rules and processes and things kind of impact and develop us that sense of racism and things like that. And so if we don't understand our past laws and things like that, we don't understand why there's particular attitudes within Australia, to then go, well, we need to address that. We need to acknowledge that. We need to change that, because we all want to live in a society where each of us is valued, where each of us is honoured. We live in a society today where it's reactionary. We jump on Facebook and someone says something and let's react to that.
Yeah.
Whereas I think this COVID situation is going, well, hang on a minute here. Why do we need to react to stuff? How do we be more gracious? How do we be kinder? How do we value the importance of relationship? When something's taken away from you, like being able to see your friends and interact and engage, when that's taken away from you, you actually realise that's actually really important. And there's some real richness in that, and you value it more. And I think as a society, let's use this opportunity, both in the business sector, but also within our families and within our communities, of really valuing the richness of society. And of one of the oldest living cultures. I mean, a great example, if we had learned the importance of Aboriginal people's cool burning. I don't know if you've ever heard of cool burning.
No.
So Aboriginal people for years and years and years have used fire to enrich the land.
Mm.
So we talk about fire management, and you've got to do, the burning off, and we've got smoke in the air around because we're doing burning to try and keep the fire load down. Yeah. Aboriginal people never burnt the country to keep the fire load down. Aboriginal people did what was called cool burning, done in a particular time of year and a particular season. And cool burning was when you burn in the cool. And what it does is it gets rid of the fuel load, but it doesn't burn the tops of the trees. But what it does is it regenerates all of the seeds, which are regenerated through bushfire smoke. Mm-hmm. And then the cool burn is actually as much about caring for the country as it is as reducing the fire load. And when half of our eastern seaboard was alight with fires this year, there were some areas within that situation that had been cool burned that didn't have the wildfires go through there. And the problem with a wildfire is the wildfire doesn't only burn and is highly dangerous, because the fire is so hot, it actually torches all the native seeds that are in the ground and fries them and basically kills them. And so the regeneration of the land takes a lot. Cool burning through the bushfire smoke and everything, and the warmth of the burn actually causes those seeds to basically generate and creates great food, wild orchids, and a whole bunch of stuff.
Mm.
If we were to take the time to learn from the ancient wisdom of cool burning, we wouldn't have had I don't believe that we would have had such damaging wildfires as we had on the eastern seaboard. The Kimberley KLC, the Kimberley mob, the African countries have actually taken the Aboriginal ranges out of the Kimberley over to the savannas in both in America, but also in the Kimberley region, to teach them about cool burning to manage the grasslands. So we've got our Aboriginal people who hold this knowledge being taken out of our country to another country to teach them this ancient wisdom, and yet in our country we don't appreciate and value that wisdom. And I just think from an economic perspective, from business, the fires affected our business community massively and affected our insurance industry and a whole bunch of stuff. You imagine if we invested 1/10 of that money into getting the knowledge of cool burning put across that area, you know, we wouldn't have future losses that we've had. So it's how do we value the richness of the ancient wisdom that we have, and how do we integrate that into our community and how we do things, and we will benefit as a community, but also as a business sector. So they're the things that I think that we've got so much to gain.
All right, Mark, that's a fantastic way to finish conversation too. I think you've summed it up perfectly.
No worries at all.
But look, Mark, thank you. It's great. I was right in trying to reach out to you. I mean, you've got a fantastic story, and I've learned a lot, and I'm glad.
Great. Well, it's great to be on your Rooster Talk, and I wish you well, and thanks for reaching out. We've got so much to share. If people want to know about FISH, we've got a Facebook page, FISH-Foundation for Indigenous Sustainable Health. Our website is www.fish.asn.au, and jump onto our YouTube channel. We're building earth houses, super adobe houses in the north on co-design and co-construction. We just opened it last week and handed it over to the Aboriginal community who design their own home, and then we work with them to build their own home. If you want to see that process, jump onto our YouTube channel. There's some great videos on there, and that's Foundation for Indigenous Sustainable Health. So there's great resources. Great to talk to you, and thanks so much.
All right. Thanks, Mark. We'll chat again.
Terrific.